"If you can't afford this office, I'll resign," Richard Cole said with a slow, confident smile, his voice echoing just enough to command the entire glass-walled boardroom. And for a second, no one spoke, not because it was funny, but because it was expected, because that was who he was, the man who always had the upper hand, the man who decided who stayed and who disappeared. And right now his eyes were locked on a woman no one had bothered to introduce, a black woman standing near the far end of the table with a paper cup in her hand, her posture straight but quiet, like she had been there long enough to be invisible. The faint hum of the city 30 floors below pressed against the windows, filtered through layers of glass and money. And still, somehow, the loudest thing in the room was the silence that followed his words. A few executives exchanged glances. One of them let out a small, nervous chuckle that died halfway through, because something about her didn't match the script. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink, didn't even look embarrassed. She just stood there, steady, as if the insult had missed its mark entirely. The overhead lights reflected across the polished table, cutting clean lines through the space between them. And then, slowly, the coffee slipped from her hand, tipping just enough to spill across the glass surface, dark liquid spreading in a thin, deliberate line toward the center. And that was when a few people finally reacted, not to her, but to the mess. Because that was easier, because that was safer. But she didn't rush, didn't apologize. She reached for a napkin with calm, precise movement, her fingers steady as she wiped the spill, her reflection flickering in the glass beneath her hand. And for the briefest moment, it was the only thing Richard noticed, not her clothes, not her presence, just that reflection, composed, unshaken, like she knew something he didn't. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under the shift of his weight, and crossed his arms, waiting, expecting a reaction that never came, expecting her to justify herself, to explain why she was there, to prove she belonged. But she didn't. Instead, she finished wiping the table and set the napkin aside with quiet finality, then reached into her bag, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed a single matte black card on the glass, right between them, the soft click of it touching the surface somehow louder than his voice had been. And that was when the room changed, not all at once, but enough for one person to lean forward, enough for another to stop typing, enough for the air itself to feel heavier, like something unseen had just entered the space. Richard's smile didn't fade, but it tightened, just slightly, the kind of shift only someone paying close attention would notice. And still, he didn't move, didn't look down, because men like him didn't need to. Men like him were never wrong. And yet, no one else laughed this time. No one echoed his confidence. And somewhere behind the glass door, footsteps approached, measured, deliberate, growing louder with every step, until the handle turned with a quiet click that somehow carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. The door opened just enough to let in a slice of brighter light from the hallway, cutting across the polished floor like a line no one dared to cross. And every head in the room turned not toward the woman anymore, but toward the man stepping inside, tall, composed, holding a thin tablet against his side, as if it carried more authority than anyone at the table. His shoes made almost no sound, yet each step felt deliberate, measured, like he already understood something the rest of them did not. And for a brief second, Richard remained exactly where he was, arms still crossed, posture unchanged, refusing to acknowledge the shift, because control was not something he gave up easily, not even to uncertainty. The man by the door glanced once at the table, then at the card resting on the glass, and that was when his expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for the tension in his jaw to tighten, enough for the air in the room to feel thinner. One of the junior executives straightened in his chair, another slowly lowered her pen, and still no one spoke, as if they were all waiting for permission to react. Naomi did not turn, did not follow the movement behind her. She simply stood there, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, fingertips barely touching the surface, steady, grounded, as though the weight of the moment did not belong to her at all. The man finally stepped fully inside and closed the door with a soft click that echoed louder than expected, sealing the room, sealing the silence. And then he walked forward, not toward Richard, but toward the card, his gaze fixed on it with a focus that made the others uneasy. He stopped just short of the table, close enough to see, not close enough to touch. And that hesitation, that single pause, was enough to fracture the illusion of certainty that had filled the room minutes ago. Richard exhaled slowly, a faint smirk returning as he leaned forward just slightly, as if reclaiming the narrative. "If this is about access," he said, his tone controlled, almost amused, "we can handle it after the meeting." But the man did not respond, did not even look at him. His attention remained on the card, on the subtle engraving that caught the overhead light at just the right angle. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear, carrying across the table without effort. "Where did you get this?" The question was not directed at the room, not even at Richard. It landed in the space between him and Naomi, and for the first time, someone shifted uncomfortably. A chair creaked. A breath was held too long. Naomi lifted her gaze just slightly, not to meet his eyes, but to acknowledge the question existed. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, almost quiet, yet it carried through the silence with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. "It was issued to me," she said, and that was all. No explanation, no justification, just a statement, clean and complete. And something in the room broke, not visibly, not all at once, but enough. Enough for the man by the table to straighten, enough for the hesitation to turn into recognition, and enough for Richard's smirk to falter, just for a fraction of a second, before he forced it back into place, because admitting doubt, even silently, was not something he was prepared to do. Not yet. Not when the rules had always worked in his favor, not when the person standing across from him was not supposed to change anything. And yet, everything in the room already had. The words settled into the room like something heavy and irreversible, and for a moment no one moved. Not even the man standing beside the table, his eyes still fixed on Naomi, as if recalculating everything he thought he understood. And then slowly, almost carefully, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim device, tapping once, twice, the faint glow reflecting against the glass surface. And that was when the screen at the far end of the room flickered to life, a quiet hum filling the silence as the company's internal system loaded, and every executive instinctively turned toward it, drawn by habit, by hierarchy, by the need to see what was about to be confirmed or denied. Richard shifted in his chair, just slightly, but enough for the leather to creak again, enough to break the stillness around him. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice tighter now, still controlled but no longer effortless. "We have a schedule to keep." But no one responded, not this time, because something larger than the meeting had taken hold, something that did not ask for permission. The man near the table did not look at Richard, did not acknowledge the interruption. He simply waited, eyes moving between the card and the screen as if aligning two versions of reality. And Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, as though the outcome had never been in question for her, as though she had already seen this moment play out long before she stepped into the room. The screen finally stabilized, rows of names and access levels appearing in clean, corporate precision, and then a pause, a brief system refresh that stretched just long enough to make every second feel longer. And then it appeared, not dramatically, not highlighted, just another line in a list that suddenly carried more weight than anything else in the room. The name Carter, Naomi, followed by a title that did not belong to speculation or assumption, Chief Executive Officer, and beneath it, full administrative authority, the kind that could not be issued lightly, the kind that could not be faked. And the room did not react all at once. It fractured, a quiet inhale from one side, a chair shifting on the other, someone whispering something under their breath that never fully formed into words, and then silence again, heavier this time. Final. Richard did not look at the screen immediately. He stared at Naomi as if the truth might change if he refused to acknowledge it, his jaw tightening, his confidence searching for something to hold on to. But there was nothing left to anchor it. And when he finally turned, when his eyes landed on the screen, the shift was subtle but undeniable. The certainty was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, something he had not needed to feel in a long time. Uncertainty, and in that space, that quiet collapse of control, Naomi moved for the first time, not away, not back, but forward, just a single step, enough to close the distance between them. Enough to stand fully in the light that reflected off the glass and steel around them. her voice calm when she spoke, not raised, not sharpened, just clear. "You asked if I could afford this office," she said. And then she paused, not for effect, but because she did not need to rush, because for the first time in the room, everyone was listening, truly listening, and even the air seemed to hold still, waiting for what came next. The pause stretched just long enough to make every person in the room aware of their own breathing. And when Naomi finally continued, her voice did not rise, it did not sharpen, it simply held steady. "I do not just afford it," she said, her eyes resting on Richard without hostility, without triumph, just clarity. "I built the system that pays for it." And the words did not land like an attack, they landed like a fact, clean and undeniable, and for a moment no one moved, not because they were waiting for a reaction, but because there was nothing left to challenge. Richard's fingers, once relaxed against the armrest, tightened slowly, the subtle shift almost invisible if not for the reflection in the glass table beneath him. His gaze flickered, not away, but inward, as if searching for something that could restore the balance he had just lost. But the room had already moved past him. The executives who had laughed minutes ago now sat straighter, their expressions carefully neutral, their eyes no longer dismissive but calculating, reassessing. One of them quietly closed a laptop that had been opened mid-presentation, the soft click echoing louder than expected, marking an end that had not been formally declared. The man near the table stepped back, slightly, giving Naomi space without being asked. A gesture so small yet so deliberate it shifted the entire dynamic of the room. She reached forward then, not abruptly, but with intention, sliding the black card back toward herself, her fingertips brushing the edge of it before lifting it off the glass. The absence of it left a faint outline in the condensation where the coffee had been, a mark that faded almost immediately, like the version of the moment that had existed just minutes before. Richard finally stood, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the kind of controlled motion that suggested he still believed he could regain something, anything. "If this is some kind of test," he began, his voice measured, though no longer effortless, "then I think it has been made clear." But even as he spoke, the words lacked the weight they once carried. They did not command the room. They simply filled the space where authority used to be. Naomi did not interrupt him. She did not need to. She waited, allowing the sentence to finish, allowing the silence after it to settle. And then she stepped past the head of the table, moving into the position that had always been reserved, her movement unhurried, natural, as if it had never belonged to anyone else. She placed the card down again, this time in front of the central seat, aligning it with the edge of the table with quiet precision, and then she looked up, her gaze moving across the room, not skipping anyone, not lingering on any one person, just acknowledging. And in that single sweep, something shifted again, not fear, not intimidation, but recognition, the kind that could not be undone. "This is not a test," she said, her tone still even, still grounded. "It is a reminder." And she let that settle, not forcing meaning onto it, not explaining further, because she did not need to, because everyone in the room already understood exactly what had just happened. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one reached for a word, no one filled the silence. They simply sat in it, aware that something fundamental had changed, something that could not be reversed by confidence or corrected by authority. And in that quiet, Richard remained standing, no longer at the center, no longer certain where his place was, as the room continued without him. The silence did not break, it settled deeper, pressing against the glass walls as if even the city outside had paused to listen. And Naomi remained standing at the head of the table, her presence no longer questioned, no longer ignored, just accepted in a way that made everything that came before feel distant, misplaced, like a version of reality that no longer fit. And across from her, Richard exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavier now, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored in certainty. His eyes flickered briefly toward the others in the room, searching for alignment, for support, for anything that could restore the balance he had always relied on. But what he found instead were lowered gazes, careful expressions, people who had already shifted their weight to the side of truth, not loyalty. One executive adjusted her blazer, another cleared his throat quietly, small movements that spoke louder than words, because they signaled distance, and distance was. Something Richard had never needed to consider before. He stepped forward then, just half a step, as if testing whether the space would still respond to him the way it always had. But the room did not move with him. It held, steady, centered somewhere else now. And that realization landed in the subtle tightening of his jaw, in the way his shoulders squared not from confidence but from resistance. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, as if choosing each word carefully could still reshape the moment. "I was not aware of your identity." And the sentence hung there, incomplete in a way that felt intentional, like it was meant to close the gap without fully acknowledging it. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, not cold, not forgiving, just present. And when he finished, she let the silence stretch just a fraction longer, enough for the meaning behind his words to settle in the room, enough for everyone to understand what had been said and what had not. Then she spoke, her tone even, almost gentle in its clarity. "You were aware of my presence," she said, and the distinction was immediate, precise, impossible to ignore, a quiet shift from identity to behavior, from who she was to how she had been treated. And that was where the weight truly landed, because it was not about titles anymore. It was about choices, and for the first time, Richard did not respond right away. His gaze dropped, just briefly, to the table, to the faint outline where the coffee had once spread, now nearly invisible. And something in that small, fleeting glance revealed more than any words could have, a recognition, not of her authority, but of his own actions, the way they had unfolded without question, without pause. And around the table, the others felt it too, that quiet shift from external power to internal accountability. One of them leaned back slightly, another folded his hands together, as if bracing for what came next. Naomi did not raise her voice, did not press further. She simply placed both hands lightly on the edge of the table, grounding herself in the space she had always owned. And then she continued, "Leadership is not tested by who you recognize," she said, her gaze steady, moving just enough to include the room. "It is revealed by how you treat those you believe cannot affect you." And the words did not accuse, they clarified. They drew a line not between positions, but between principles. And in that moment, the room understood that what had just happened was larger than a single exchange, larger than a single mistake. It was a reflection, and reflections, once seen, could not be unseen. Richard straightened slightly, as if absorbing the weight of it, his expression no longer guarded by confidence, but shaped by something quieter, something more uncertain. And the room remained still, not out of fear, but out of awareness, because something fundamental had shifted, and no one was sure what would come next. The room did not rush to fill the silence that followed. It held it, as if every person understood that speaking too soon would only weaken what had just been revealed. And Naomi remained still at the head of the table, her hands resting lightly against the glass, her posture grounded not in dominance, but in certainty. While outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the late afternoon light shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the polished surface, turning every movement into something slower, more deliberate. And across from her Richard stood without moving, the distance between them no longer defined by space, but by something quieter, something internal, his shoulders no longer squared in control, but held in place by thought, by the weight of realization settling in piece by piece. Not all at once, never all at once. His gaze moved briefly to the others in the room again. But this time it was not searching for agreement. It was searching for context, for understanding of how quickly things had changed. And what he found instead was stillness, not judgment, not sympathy, just a collective awareness that something had shifted beyond individual roles. One of the senior partners leaned back slightly, folding his hands together as if allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Another executive glanced down at her notes, but did not write, her pen hovering just above the page, suspended in hesitation. And Naomi finally moved, not away from the table, but along it, taking a slow step that brought her closer to the center of the room, her heels making a soft, steady sound against the floor that echoed just enough to mark the passage of time. And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter than before, not because it lacked strength, but because it did not need volume to carry. "There was a time," she said, her gaze not fixed on anyone in particular, but moving just enough to include them all. When I sat in rooms like this and no one asked who I was, and the words did not accuse, they reflected, they opened a window into something that existed before this moment, something that gave it context without demanding sympathy. Not because it did not matter, she continued, but because it was easier to assume. And the room listened differently now, not as observers of an event, but as participants in something larger, something that extended beyond the boundaries of this meeting. Richard's expression shifted slightly, not defensive, not resistant, but thoughtful in a way that suggested he was hearing more than just the words, that he was tracing them backward, trying to understand the pattern they described. And Naomi paused, letting the space breathe, letting the silence do what explanation could not. The faint hum of the building's ventilation system filled the gap, steady, almost rhythmic, like a reminder that time was still moving even as the room seemed suspended. Assumptions feel efficient, she said finally, her tone unchanged, until they cost you something you cannot measure. And that was where the weight settled again, not on any one person, but across the entire table, because it was no longer about a single exchange. It was about the system that allowed it to happen without question. One executive shifted in his seat, his hands clasping together a little tighter. Another exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but present, and Richard lowered his gaze, just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, as if the clarity of the moment had finally reached a place he could not ignore. And Naomi did not press further. She did not demand a response. She simply stood there, allowing the realization to exist without interruption, because sometimes the most powerful shift was not in what was said next, but in what could no longer be denied. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt defined, like a line had been drawn that no one could step back across. And for a long moment no one moved, not because they were waiting for instruction, but because they were processing something that had shifted beneath them, something that had been invisible until now. And Richard stood there with his hands resting lightly against the edge of the table, no longer gripping, no longer asserting control, just holding himself steady, his gaze no longer fixed outward but turning inward, tracing the path of the last few minutes. Each word, each reaction, each assumption that had come so easily before, and now felt heavy in retrospect. His reflection stared back at him from the glass surface, slightly distorted by the light, but clear enough to see the difference, clear enough to recognize that the version of himself that had spoken earlier no longer fit the reality in front of him. And across the room Naomi did not move to fill the space. She did not press him. She did not demand anything. She simply allowed the moment to exist, and in that allowance, something changed, because the absence of pressure made the weight of choice unavoidable. One of the executives shifted in his chair, finally breaking the stillness just enough to signal that time had not stopped. Another glanced at the screen again, as if needing confirmation that what they had seen was real, still there, still undeniable. And it was. The title remained. The authority remained. Nothing had been taken back. Nothing had been softened. And Richard exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but deliberate, like a decision forming before it was spoken. He straightened, not in defense, not in performance, but in acknowledgement. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty that had once defined it. I made an assumption, he said, the words simple, direct, and for the first time, complete, not framed, not softened, just stated. And the room did not react immediately, because they understood what it meant, not just the admission itself, but the fact that it had come without excuse, without deflection. Naomi's gaze met his then, not sharply, not triumphantly, just steadily, as if measuring not the words, but the space they came from. And she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, not forgiveness, but recognition. And that subtle gesture carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because it acknowledged the shift, without diminishing what had happened. And Richard continued, his voice still controlled, but grounded in something more real. And I spoke from that assumption. He added, the second layer landing heavier than the first, because it connected thought to action, belief to behavior. And in that connection, the room understood the full arc of the moment, not just what had been revealed, but what had led to it. Naomi stepped slightly to the side then, not retreating, but opening the space again, allowing the room to breathe, allowing the conversation to move forward without erasing what had just been faced, and the executives around the table began to shift, not dramatically, but enough to signal readiness, readiness to continue, not as they had before, but with a new awareness, one that could not be ignored, one that would shape every word that followed. And Richard remained standing for a second longer before slowly taking his seat, not at the center, not reclaiming position, but accepting placement within the room as it now existed. And in that quiet, deliberate movement, something settled, not as resolution, but as truth, something that would remain long after the meeting ended, long after the room emptied, long after the reflections faded from the glass. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not. Something had already shifted too deeply, and yet the meeting did not end. It moved forward, quieter, more deliberate, as if every word now carried weight that had not existed before. Naomi took her seat at the head of the table, not as a gesture of dominance, but as a continuation of what had always been true, her movements precise, unhurried, her attention returning to the materials in front of her, as if the interruption had simply been part of the process, not the defining moment of it. And that alone changed the atmosphere, because she did not dwell on what had happened. She did not replay it. She let it settle into the room as context, not spectacle. One of the executives cleared his throat softly and reopened his laptop, the screen casting a faint glow across his face. Another adjusted a stack of printed reports, aligning the edges carefully, almost instinctively, as if order could be re-established through small, controlled actions, and gradually, the rhythm of the meeting resumed, but it was not the same rhythm. It was slower, more aware, each voice entering with a level of consideration that had not been there before. Richard sat among them now, not silent, but measured, his contributions brief, focused, stripped of the casual authority he once carried. And every time he spoke, there was a pause afterward, not imposed, but natural, as if the room itself was recalibrating how it received him. Naomi listened, not interrupting, not correcting unless necessary, her presence steady, consistent, and when she did speak, the room responded immediately, not out of obligation, but alignment, because clarity had replaced assumption, and assumption had been what shaped everything before. At one point she glanced toward Richard, not to single him out, but to include him. "Walk us through your projections again," she said, her tone even, professional, and for a brief moment, he hesitated, not because he lacked the answer, but because he was aware of the space he now occupied within the room. And then he nodded once, straightening slightly as he began, his voice steady, grounded in substance rather than position. And as he spoke, the others listened, truly listened, not to the authority behind his words, but to the content itself. And that shift, subtle as it was, marked something significant, something earned rather than assumed. Naomi followed along, occasionally asking a question, not to challenge, but to clarify, guiding the conversation with a quiet precision that required no force. And in that exchange, something else began to take shape. Not reconciliation, not resolution, but a different kind of balance, one that did not erase what had happened, but did not trap them in it either. The light outside the windows had softened now, casting a warmer tone across the room. The reflections on the glass table, less sharp, more diffuse, as if even the environment had adjusted to the new pace. And when the discussion reached a natural pause, Naomi closed the folder in front of her with a soft, final sound, her hands resting lightly on top of it. "We will continue this tomorrow," she said, her voice calm, definitive, and no one questioned it. No one rushed to speak over it. They simply nodded, one by one, gathering their things with quiet efficiency, chairs sliding back, laptops closing, papers being stacked and tucked away. And as they stood, there was a subtle shift in how they moved around the table, a quiet awareness of one another that had not been present before. Richard remained seated for a moment, longer, his gaze resting on the surface of the table, tracing the faint patterns left by light and reflection. And then he stood as well, slower than before, not delayed, but deliberate. And as the room began to empty, he looked once more toward Naomi, not with expectation, not with defense, but with something quieter, something closer to understanding, and she met his gaze briefly, just long enough to acknowledge it. Before turning toward the door, her steps steady as she moved forward, leaving behind a room that was no longer the same and could not return to what it had been. The hallway outside the boardroom felt different, quieter in a way that was not empty but settled. As Naomi stepped out into the soft glow of the evening lights, the polished floor reflecting her silhouette with each measured step, her pace steady, unhurried, as if the weight of what had just happened did not need to follow her, because it had already done its work. Behind her the door closed with a muted click, sealing the room and everything it had held, leaving only the faint echo of voices that no longer carried the same tone. And for a moment she paused near the glass wall overlooking the city, the skyline stretching wide beneath a fading sky. Buildings lit one by one as daylight gave way to something calmer, something more reflective, and she rested her hand lightly against the cool surface, her gaze moving across the horizon not in search of anything, but in recognition of distance, of time, of everything that had led to this point. Not just the meeting, not just the moment, but the years that had shaped the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she chose silence when others expected reaction. And inside the room Richard remained standing long after the others had left, the chairs now empty, the table cleared, the screen dark again. And in that stillness he looked around as if seeing the space for the first time, not as a position to hold, but as a place that reflected something back to him. His footsteps slow as he moved toward the head of the table, stopping just short of the seat that had once felt like the center, his hand hovering over the back of the chair before, resting there briefly, not to claim it, but to understand it, the weight of it, the responsibility he had once reduced to status without realizing it. And he exhaled, not sharply, not heavily, just enough to release what he had been holding without knowing, then turned toward the glass wall inside the room, his reflection meeting him again, clearer now, unfiltered by motion or distraction. And for a moment he stood there, not correcting, not defending, just observing, as if the most important thing left to do was to see clearly what had always been there. And outside Naomi lowered her hand from the glass and continued walking, her heels marking a quiet rhythm down the corridor, passing by offices where lights flickered on, where conversations continued, where work carried forward, unchanged and yet not the same. And as she moved past a small plaque mounted beside a doorway, the engraved letters caught the light for just a second. Carter, Naomi, Chief Executive Officer, simple, unembellished, permanent, and she did not stop to look at it, did not need to, because identity was not something she paused to confirm. It was something she carried without announcement, without demand, and further down the hall she disappeared around the corner, her presence leaving behind nothing but the quiet shift she had created, the kind that did not need to be repeated to be remembered. And back in the boardroom, Richard finally stepped away from the table, the space now still, the reflections fading as the last of the light dimmed, and he walked toward the door, not quickly, not slowly, just with intention, pausing for a brief second before reaching for the handle, his hand resting there as if acknowledging something unseen, something internal that had changed. And then he opened the door and stepped out into the same hallway, the same building, the same world, but not as the same man, because some moments do not end when the room empties. They continue, quietly, shaping what comes next in ways that cannot be undone, only understood.